Welcome everybody, I'm Andrea and today we'll be making some sauerkraut. We've got our cabbage, our carrots, and some ginger. Although if you prefer a plainer flavor, then you're welcome to leave aside the carrot and the ginger and only use cabbage and salt for a very simple flavor. If you do prefer a more traditional flavor, you can get hold of some caraway and juniper, and that makes a very traditional sauerkraut flavor that you may recognize from restaurants or if you ever backpacked through Germany. So to begin with, I'm going to simply discard the outer leaves that don't look very nice anymore of the first couple heads of cabbage, but I'm not going to wash these or soak them or do anything else drastic other than remove any dirty or ugly bits, because we want the bacteria that's already covering this cabbage. And that is what we're going to favor into producing our lactobacillus to get our nice, yummy, crunchy, sour sauerkraut. If we were to start with some cabbage that was washed, we might be washing away some of that bacteria that we actually want to encourage. I'll put that aside and pull up my big bowl. This is my cabbage slicer. If you don't have a cabbage slicer, then you can just simply use a knife and a cutting board and try to get the bits as fine as you can, but really you don't need to be picky. I'm actually going to start by just slicing a piece off, because it makes it a little bit easier. If you're slicing yourself, you want to slice a bit off just so it rests on the cutting board a little bit more nicely, and then you can start to shave off your little strands that way. But if you get really excited about sauerkraut and you start to want to make large volumes at a time, a cabbage slicer really saves you time, and it makes very even, delicious strands that are a little bit more uniform. These blades are really sharp, so watch your fingers, and you simply run the cabbage up and down. So the history of sauerkraut goes back hundreds of thousands of years, and virtually every single culture in the globe has had their versions of fermented vegetables of one kind or another, or some sorts of fermented foods. All of the condiments that we know of, like relish and ketchup and soy sauce, those are all traditionally fermented condiments and fermented foods. So even though sauerkraut has been traced back to ancient China and all over, the name sauerkraut, or Sauerkraut, comes from the German phrase for sour cabbage. And it's been long recognized as actually being a form of alchemy, because the bacterial fermentation process literally transforms the cabbage. And it becomes a completely different product than what you started with. So, just in that one cabbage, we've probably got enough to fill our mason jar. So you can see we've got these beautiful strands of cabbage now. And I'm going to set that aside and grate up a little bit of carrot and some ginger to add to the mix. For that amount of cabbage, I tend to just go by color and appearance. Really isn't as important the exact quantity of carrot or other vegetables that you want to put in here. So that, I think I'm going to add one more carrot, and then it should be sufficient. I'm going to use, if I'm only making 1 liter jar, then I'm probably only going to use about a piece of ginger the size of my thumb or smaller. And I tend to do it on the finer grate. That way it evenly disperses it. If you really, really love ginger, then you can absolutely cut it up more chunky, and then you can get, you know, a nice big piece of ginger. So I use something called the weigh method when I make my sauerkraut, and that is basically using the weight of your vegetables that you're fermenting to determine how much salt you're adding, so that you'll always have a perfect batch of sauerkraut every time. You can go by taste and just slowly add salt until it tastes right for you, but when you're just starting out, after you've gone through all of this work and, you know, grown or bought these vegetables, then you want to make sure that you're getting a tasty batch of sauerkraut. Salt is what makes the difference between having delicious sauerkraut or rotten vegetables. So salt, the more you add, the longer the fermentation process will take and the more acidic it will become. But if you add too much salt, it'll actually inhibit fermentation altogether. So it's a fine balance, and I find the weigh method is the easiest way to make sure that your brine is salty enough to get a good ferment, but not too salty to inhibit fermentation altogether or make it inedibly salty. So I'm just gonna grab another bowl so I can weigh exactly what I need. All right, so we're zeroed in. So the general recommendation is that you add 4 teaspoons of salt per kilo. Okay, so a kilo is 1,000 grams. So we've got 499 grams without our added carrot and ginger. So this should pretty much put us perfectly where we want to be. Yep. We're just over half a kilo, which means I'm gonna add 2 teaspoons of salt to this. Just gonna massage that ginger and carrot in there a bit. And I'm gonna take my salt and my little measuring spoons and sprinkle that evenly over our cabbage. Just a teeny little bit more for luck. All right. So now you want to really massage and mix in that salt with the cabbage. And if you don't have a digital scale, you can use one like this that just gets set by twisting that little dial. And like I said, you also don't need to use the weigh method at all. You're very welcome to eyeball it and add salt and just taste as you go. And after you've made it a few times, you really do develop a feel for what is the right amount for you. So I'm rubbing, massaging, and giving a good squeeze, and that is encouraging the juices to be released from the vegetables. And if you're making a really large batch especially, it's kind of nice to just give it a good massage after you've added the salt and then leave it aside for even up to an hour. And that salt, that thyme and that salt is going to draw out a ton of moisture so that you start to see a brine as you squeeze the cabbage. And then you can come back to it and pack it into your vessel. And when you're fermenting, you don't need any special equipment. All you need is your vegetables, some salt. You can actually do salt-free ferments, but they don't keep as long and they are much more likely to go off. So you want to have some sort of a jar, but you can ferment in almost anything. The key is that you have to keep it anaerobic. So the lactobacillus work in an anaerobic environment, which means they don't want any oxygen. Oxygen will ruin your final product. You will not have tasty sauerkraut if it's been exposed to the air. So I don't know if you can see already, there is a lot of liquid that's coming out of that cabbage. Get the jar ready here with my handy funnel. I really do recommend, if you get into fermenting in any regular way, that you invest in a canning funnel because they make it really, really easy to pack everything in. So with sauerkraut, you're aiming for at least a 2.5% salt brine. So you can see even after all of that is in there, it's surprising what will fit. So we can do another batch of that, about the same size, and then we'll finish packing it down. So I'm going to set my bowl aside. Probably good. All right, so I'm gonna set that aside again. Grate up a few more carrots. So there are a few major reasons that cabbage has traditionally been used and widely used in ferments. One is that cabbage is really, really rich in vitamin C. So I believe that it was Captain Cook who was recognized as being able to conquer scurvy by traveling on his boats with large quantities of sauerkraut. Some other reasons are that cabbage actually stimulates stomach acid production, which helps you digest your meals. Right, a little bit more ginger. Pop that on the scale again. Perfect. So we've got just about 500 grams again. So I'm going to put another 2 teaspoons of salt. So when this process begins, it's actually coliform bacteria that are starting the process. And as the coliform bacteria start to do their work, they produce an acid. And as the pH drops and becomes more and more acidic, eventually another bacteria present called leukostronic bacteria will start to thrive. And as the numbers of leukostronic bacteria increase, the pH will further decrease and become more acidic. So the coliform counts start to go way down. And as the leukostronic bacteria rises, now the lactobacilli will start to do their work. And then they produce even more acids. And that is, the final result is that you've got sauerkraut that's really, really rich in lactobacilli, which are bacteria that are really, really beneficial for our own immune systems that interact with our intestinal microbes and are able to help teach our immune systems. I'm gonna grab my jar and pack this in. And we are officially full. So that's nice and full. And I'm gonna remove the funnel. So you can see we want all of that brine right to the top and the sauerkraut below it. So I'm just gonna pop a lid on that. And we'll be able to set this aside, and within a few days it'll have a lot of activity. It's a good idea to put a plate underneath it because sometimes there's so much gases and activity that the liquid is forced out of the sealed jar and can run all over your counter. So you want to put it in a bowl or on some sort of a plate with a lip that can catch that in case it happens. But make sure you're giving it a little burp every couple days after the first 2. If it's warm in your kitchen, it's going to go a lot quicker. So you want to just make sure it's not gonna kind of blow up out of there, because these mason jar rings, even though they're tough, when under a lot of pressure, they can actually burst right out. And then you'll have a lot of sauerkraut juices flowing onto your counter everywhere. So after about 4 or 5 days even, it can be ready to go in the fridge. The best way to know is to stick a fork in there and taste it. And if it starts tasting really nice and sour and crispy, then that's when you'll know that it's time to go and put it in the fridge, and then you can enjoy it after that. And it can stay in the fridge for a pretty long time. We will do large batches or many batches and then have it all year round. So a mason jar is the easiest fermentation vessel you can use as far as making sure that air doesn't get to it so mold doesn't grow. But you can also invest in something like this. So this is a fermentation crock. And it's a special vessel that's designed to have a airtight portion where you can put some water, and that way you keep the gases able to release, but oxygen is not able to get in. So that this is a 7.5 liter, but you can get them absolutely enormous to the point where you can stand in them to push the sauerkraut down. This I find is a nice family size for making enough kraut for a few months at a time. We usually, when we're eating a lot of sauerkraut, will go through at least a jar a week in our family because we're having it, each of us, about a tablespoon with each meal. So these guys have weights. So you'll pack your sauerkraut in here, and then you're able to use a weight to hold it down. If your sauerkraut is really floating up in your jar, you can even find a flat rock and boil it to sterilize it, and use a rock or something similar. I have a friend who's a glass blower, and I've had a few weights made out of Pyrex glass that I can use for my ferments as well. And so you'll pack that in, weight it down, put the lid on, and fill the rim with water. And the crock, when you do it in a crock, the fermentation time is a lot longer. So a large vessel like this will take longer than a week. Usually I'll leave it for at least a month, sometimes two, before I open it up and check it. And then after that, we'll take it out of the crock, pack it into mason jars, and store it in the fridge. So some other benefits of cabbage are that cabbage contains sulfur compounds, including sulforaphane, which are very anti-tumor and anti-cancer. So sauerkraut itself is always creating a ton of enzymes that your body can also use to also benefit digestive function. So eating sauerkraut with your meals not only will enhance your stomach acid and your ability to break down the rest of your meal, but it will give you a lot of nutrition that the bacteria create for you by digesting the starches in the cabbage. So they'll be producing lactic acid as well as vitamins and other compounds. They also work on the minerals in the cabbage and the other vegetables, and they are able to transform those minerals into a form that's more absorbable for you. So I hope that you'll all be excited to try making some sauerkraut at home, and tell me how it goes. Enjoy.